Hello and welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm John Bachman, and with us now is Virginia Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli. Ken, great talking with you again.
Good to be with you, John.
Well, I want to talk to you and get your perspective as an Attorney General here. We know 26 states were part of a lawsuit involved in this. Your state was also involved in a lawsuit. Give us your reaction to the Supreme Court ruling today, and what do you think it means for the state of Virginia?
You know, my first reaction was very negative, but as we got through the opinions, I got a lot more optimistic. You know, my first job as an Attorney General is protection of the Constitution and of individual liberty, and I've told people for 2 years this case is about liberty, not health care. And the constitutional protections we were aiming at, we actually got in this opinion. And yet the bill mostly still stands, with the exception of the Medicaid portion as it relates to states. And it was very unusual how the Supreme Court came to its conclusion. They agreed with us that the Commerce Clause doesn't allow the Congress to compel people into commerce, in this case to buy health insurance. That was the biggest threat to liberty out there. They also explicitly said there's an outer limit, and they identified the outer limit to commerce power. They have never done that since the New Deal. So we actually got an outer limit on this power of the Congress for the first time since the New Deal. We also, for the first time since the New Deal, got an outer limit on the power of the federal government using its spending power to compel states to spend money, and this is the Medicaid piece that I mentioned. And it's also, for the Commonwealth of Virginia and for all the states, it's the part that hits our budgets the hardest, and this is the part we won in the bill. The bill cannot be used to compel Virginia to massively expand its Medicaid program with the threat of taking away all our other Medicaid money. The Supreme Court said that was unconstitutional coercion, and it went beyond what's allowable under the spending power of the Constitution. And again, that's the first time since the New Deal that any limit whatsoever has been put on the federal spending power. So we did very well there. So you can reasonably ask, well, then why is the bill still standing? And the reason is that the Chief Justice said that the penalty that you have to pay if you don't buy their approved health insurance was a tax for purposes of the Constitution. Interestingly, he said it's a tax in part because it wouldn't cover health care. You know, you have to pay about a $700 penalty if you don't buy their government-approved health insurance. And $700 is never going to buy you a health insurance policy. He said if it did, if they raise the amount of the dollars you've got to pay to the point where it would equate to buying a health insurance policy, then it would not be a tax for constitutional purposes. It would be a penalty. And the easiest way that I've found to think about that is if it's like restitution to the government, then it wouldn't be a tax and it couldn't be upheld. And I think there'll be some litigation around that point, particularly if any of the businesses that are fined $3,000 per employee can point to health insurance policies, say for individual employees, that they could buy in that price range. They could argue this is not a tax, and so this bill as it applies to my business is not constitutional. So you're gonna see some more litigation coming out of that. And I would point out, finally, that because they relied on this taxing argument, that forever in the future, every congressman, every senator that votes on a bill like this that is an attempt to regulate some part of our economy and our lives, that raises a penny if you don't obey their expected structure and what you got to buy, that's going to be a tax bill. And there's no type of bill that Americans hold their elected officials more accountable for than increased taxes. Remember how they passed this thing. They screamed all the way to the bank, this is not a tax, this is not a tax, this is not a tax. And now the Supreme Court has said, in fact, that it is. And so that gives us all sorts of protections with Congress and the federal government. What it doesn't do is take down the health care bill. So that's still a political fight that's left to the voters and our elected representatives, which means November 6th looms very large in this debate.
Well, let me back up a little bit and talk about that $700 penalty for individuals and $3,000 penalty for businesses. What is my motivation if I'm an individual and I could only face a charge of $700, an additional tax or fee or whatever you want to call it, $700 at the end of the year. Or if I have a family and I'm looking at a potential of a couple $1,000s a month for a health insurance premium, or if I'm a business and I'm looking at similar fees, if the tax at the end of this is less than the actual cost of health insurance, what's my incentive to go ahead and sign up for health insurance?
In fact, the Chief Justice pointed out that because there's no compulsion, you can't go to jail, for instance, and because there is a reason for you to just pay the penalty and not buy health insurance, that's why he called it a tax for constitutional purposes, because you don't have, under the structure of this bill, much incentive to go buy their government-approved health insurance. You're better off just paying the penalty.
And also what you said about the Obama administration saying over and over again, and there's plenty of film out there of them saying this is not a tax. Do you think that they intentionally misled the public, or do you think they simply didn't know what they were talking about?
Well, some of the folks in Congress were just not being honest with the American people, and others just didn't know what they were talking about, frankly. And it's a combination of the two. And the Supreme Court has provided us a degree of clarity in this area, but they did it by reading the tax power fairly broadly. Now, the taxing power is what was used for Medicare, was what was used for Social Security. This is not a new or an expansion of federal power in any way, which is why I feel like we've won on the principles, we've won on the Constitution, but we lost on the healthcare policy. So we did well. If you'd asked me at the beginning, would I take this? I'd say yes, because 100 years from now, what really matters is, can our federal government compel you into commerce in order to regulate you? Can they make you buy a car? Can they make you buy broccoli? And they cannot.
Let me ask you about that last question again one more time. You talked about the members of Congress. Some misled the public. Some didn't know what they were talking about. But specifically with President Obama, when he was talking to ABC News' George Stephanopoulos, and he said over and over again, this is not a tax. Do you think the president specifically was misleading the public, or he simply didn't know what he was talking about?
That's a hard one for me to guess at. But he went on to say right after your quote, George, my opponents say everything's a tax. Well, guess what? The Supreme Court just did. And in fact, it was a tax when they were voting on it. And it's interesting, when it was advantageous to them, they said, well, it's not a tax, it's not a tax. And then when they needed more defenses in the lawsuit because they had such a weak legal case, they said, oh no, it's a tax, it's a tax. So it was very, very much an opportunistic approach to this, but no one will ever be able to make those kinds of deceitful arguments again. It will always and forever be considered a tax bill when you see anything like this ever again in the future.
And one last question for you. You mentioned the potential of additional litigation lawsuits as a result of this. Do you plan to file anything specifically, and if so, when do you think that would happen?
What we're looking at now is the specific impact on the Commonwealth of Virginia's government. We have to make the decision whether to pursue an exchange or not, and that has not only impacts on Virginia's government, but also potentially on private sector participants, businesses in Virginia. If we do not pursue an exchange, there is an argument to be made that they cannot be penalized, the $2,000 or $3,000 penalty. And obviously, we'll want to hear from our business community on that as to which course they might prefer, but it's also a policy decision for the governor and the legislature. You can bet I'm going to be pushing us to be as restrained as possible about all this, but we're assessing the damage and what remains. But we have been given the biggest and most enormous budget tool of them all by not being compelled into this Medicaid expansion if we choose not to participate. So that's going to be a big question for Virginia as well.
Well, there are a lot of state attorneys general asking those same questions tonight. I want to thank you very much for your time. Virginia Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli, great talking with you.
Good to be with you, John.